Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us for this afternoon's panel. I'm really excited to moderate this discussion. My name is Brittny Saunders. I am principal of Three View Strategies, and we have assembled here a wonderful group of people who are doing incredibly important work across New York State to combat and prevent hate and bias. So I'm going to start with just some super quick introductions of our panelists. I'll also point out that there is more in-depth information in their biographies, so please take a look at the program if you'd like to learn more. I'm going to start with Rabbi Moshe Hauer. Rabbi Hauer is with the Orthodox Union. Next, we have Eugena O. of the Asian American Foundation. After that, we have Dr. Debbie Almontaser of the Bridging Cultures Group. We also have with us Nikki Singh of the Sikh Coalition. We have as well Audacia Ray, who is Director of Community Organizing and Public Advocacy at the New York City Anti-Violence Project. We also have with us Frankie Miranda, who is President of the Hispanic Federation. And then finally, we have Reverend Mark Blue, who is Chapter President of the NAACP's Buffalo, and also with the Second Baptist Church. Reverend Blue, thank you. And before we jump in and we have our panelists begin with a few words, I just also want to mention that, the Division on Human Rights worked really hard to put together a panel that was going to be broad and representative. However, we also acknowledge that there are many, many communities across New York State that experience hate and bias, and we couldn't necessarily have everyone on stage today, but we do want to say that the state is committed to working with all of those communities and has some new initiatives that I think you've already heard about and may hear some more about to support that work. But we're going to start by inviting each of our panelists to say a few words about the constituencies that they work with and the issues that they are confronting right now when it comes to hate and bias-based incidents. And I'm going to start with Rabbi Hauer.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. We're grateful. We're grateful to have such an assembly. You asked me to speak about my community, but I think this is my community. We are all together. All of us are here together, and we face one common enemy, and that's hate. And hate comes in different flavors. And I don't. Are we going to engage in a competition who gets more? I hope not. I hope not. But what is unsettling the community that I'm here, I serve. I have the privilege to serve as the executive vice president of the Orthodox Union, which is an assembly of Orthodox Jewish congregations and organizations, the Orthodox Jewish community. We have been experiencing, along with the rest of the country, the elevated level of hate and a specifically intense level of that expressed towards our community. The national statistics have it that north of 50% of religious-based hate crimes are targeting Jewish people. In New York State, general hate crimes, more than a third have been anti-Jewish hate crimes. And that is something which has deeply affected our community. It concerns our community. We're not going anywhere. Thank God we're staying. By nature, our community is, large parts of it are visible. In fact, in terms of anti-Jewish activities, a majority of them, significant majority, are directed at visibly Orthodox Jews who can be noticed by a skull cap and sometimes even by more specific and distinguished characteristics of dress and of appearance, and often live in clusters, in communities, frequent prayer spaces. We have community schools and neighborhoods. And we're not going anyplace. We're not going to change the way we look. We're here. We're Americans. We're New Yorkers. and we're part of the community. So how does it affect us? It affects us the way it's affecting society as a whole. And if I can, just note one thing which is a big part of this issue of hate. There's a term we bandy about sometimes, conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories they're a growth industry in the United States at this point in time. And they are a symptom, and in fact, they grow these qualities of distrust and of cynicism. Anti-Jewish hatred historically has thrived on conspiracy theories about how we control the world. I mean, I can't even control my train tickets. But we control the world, and people have all these interesting narratives about us, just like they have about every community that's represented here. And we live our reality. And the way it works, there's a proverb which says that the hearts of people reflect each other like water reflects an image. How people look at you ends up being the way you look at them. And our greatest concern, and I think that what we can continue to heal here together, is that when you're not trusted, then you stop trusting. You continue to live in the society, but you look at everybody and you wonder, how do they feel about me? What are they doing? What are they doing against me? What are they doing for me? And we need a society where not just, love is sometimes too easy a term to use. We need to rebuild trust. We need to somehow get rid a little bit of the cynicism and rebuild trust together as a community that works together, that sits together, and that builds trust with each other.
Eugena?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that. I was riveted. I am Eugena O, and I'm with the Asian American Foundation. We are a newer national organization that is fundamentally transforming the future for all Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders through a combination of funding, convening, and incubating. We are really trying to create a safer and more inclusive world for all people, and we're doing that by concentrating our work across 4 pillars: anti-hate, education, narrative change, and resources and representation. Our goal is to cultivate empathy and reclaim our own narratives as a community. And just, I think, quickly, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have been experiencing, hate and bias from the moment we arrived here in this country, whether it was, Filipinos in Louisiana or Koreans and Japanese in Hawaii, which at that point was not a part of this country, but let's just leave that alone for now. Whether it was building the Transcontinental Railroad as Chinese immigrants or trying to open up laundromats in San Francisco and just earn a living, right? So I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a very long-standing part of our history here. A lot of it stemming from this concept of being perpetual foreigners or forever foreigners. And actually, a study that we published last week at the beginning of Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month and Jewish American Heritage Month, the status survey, which really looks at the perception of Asian Americans in this country from outside and from within our community, shows that 1 in 4 Americans still thinks that Asian Americans have greater loyalty to the country where they were born, where others perceive us to have been born, than to the U.S., right? So you can see that the threads, the underpinnings, the roots of some of these challenges that we face as a community are still very much present in current American perception. So I'll just give you some statistics, because I think my experience has been that sharing these statistics does have a little bit of a shock value and a wake-up call. So in a study conducted by the Asian American Federation, one of our wonderful partners here in New York City, from January 2020 to March 2022, there were 2,627 incidents of anti-Asian hate in New York City. So in our study, the status index, 1 in 5, or 20% of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have experienced hate or bias in the past 2 years. And as a result, more than half of our community feels unsafe in public spaces, which results in altering our routines, right, to avoid public spaces, in particular at night, especially if you are identifying as a woman. Of course, there is a tremendous, and Rabbi, kind of alluded to this, mental health impact, right? The anxiety and the fear that this creates, and kind of the long-term trauma that this creates that, we now have to kind of deal with as a full community. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention some of these larger, things that are happening within and outside of New York State. The recent mass shooting in Allen, Texas, where 4 of the 8, or 50% of the victims, were Asian American or Asian identifying. And, information is coming to light that the shooter was actually, he espoused some white supremacist values, anti-immigrant sentiment, and likely did target Allen as an area where there is a large and rapidly growing Asian American and Asian immigrant population. So these are just some of the realities that the community is facing. And I think ultimately, what I can say about us is that we are not okay. And I'll end there.
Assalamu alaikum, peace and greetings, my sisters and brothers. It's really an honor and a privilege to be on this distinguished panel. My name is Dr. Debbie Almontaser. I am the CEO and founder of Bridging Cultures Group, which is a consulting company that provides training and coaching in dismantling stereotypes, anti-racism work, Islamophobia, and all of the isms that we all are well aware of. I also wear multiple hijabs. I am the board chair of the Muslim Community Network. You can laugh. We got to embrace our diversity, right? So I don't wear a hat, I wear a hijab. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Yemeni American Merchants Association, and I'm also the senior advisor of Engage. So really honored to be here and just share with you from all of these different entities that I belong to what the experience is of American Muslims. As you all know, Islamophobia and anti-Muslim, anti-Arab rhetoric and sentiment has been ongoing. Many seem to think that it began in the aftermath of September 11th. Actually, that's not the case. It's been around for hundreds of years. And you can certainly watch a documentary called Real Bad Arabs by Jack Shaheen, and it's Real, R-E-E-L, which shows how far back as early in our country's history of the black and white silent movies where they depicted Arabs and Muslims in a negative light. So as you will see as we continue to talk, this type of hate exists. And has existed, and what is the objective here is how do we counter it? I'm proud to say that the Muslim Community Network, which Aji Fanta is here, one of the staffers, and Fatima, I want to thank them for their hard work at MCN. Within the last couple of years, they did a very important study that was actually supported with a grant by the Office of Prevention of Hate Crimes. Hassan Naveed, thank you for that grant. He's the executive director of that office. I know he's somewhere out there. I can't see you, None of us can see you. But with this study, it gave the organization an opportunity to actually find out what are the typical hate crime incidents that are happening. And by the way, the reason that the funding was given was because organizations and community leaders within the American Muslim community have said, there are incidents happening in our community, but people are not reporting them. Now, you must be wondering why they're not reporting them. We wish we can get them to report them. But there's stigma. There's cultural stigma. There's fear. There's a variety of things that the community goes through that they're actually afraid to go forward. And if they're undocumented, they're afraid to go forward. So we at the organization at MCN figured out, how do we reach the masses to find out what is really happening in the community? So the staff went from mosque to mosque, left a box there that people are able to actually fill out a form and anonymously put it there. The organization collected over a couple of hundred of these surveys, and what they found was 76% of Muslims surveyed have witnessed a hate crime. 49% have been victims of a hate crime. 43.5% of school-age Muslim youth between the ages of 10 and 18 years old experienced or witnessed a hate crime in 2019. 63.9% of those that experienced a hate crime identify as female. 26.7% of Black Muslims and 31.9% of Asian Muslims expressed experiencing or witnessing a hate crime in the first half of 2022. As you all know, Muslims don't all look alike. They come in every shade, from every ethnic and racial background. And so it's really disheartening to hear of these statistics that exist. And it's been heart-wrenching. And one of the things that we continually are struggling with within the community is helping people understand the importance of reporting. So forums like this and opportunities to educate people about the importance of reporting will help us be able to do a whole lot more. Now, I just gave you a snapshot of what is happening in New York City. I can't imagine what it would be at a statewide level, and not to mention on a national level, which in past years when we've looked at the FBI data, it was also very astonishing. And let's not forget, we just finished 4 years of an incredibly horrible Muslim ban. And the impact that that had on the community psychologically, emotionally, was very traumatic. Traumatic for our children, traumatic for our women. It's just incredible. And so I hope that we never have to visit another 4 years as we have in the past. So I'll stop there.
Hi, everyone. Nikki Singh with the Sikh Coalition. So I'll start by sharing just a little bit of background on the Sikh Coalition and who Sikhs are. So the Sikh Coalition is the nation's largest Sikh civil rights advocacy and legal organization. We were founded just within the days after 9/11, when the Sikh community started experiencing an increase in hate and discrimination. And I phrase it that way on purpose because, like Dr. Debbie said, a lot of our communities have experienced hate since we first came to this country. So Sikhs have been in the United States for, over 100 years. Sikhism is the 5th largest organized religion in the world. There are over 500,000 of us here in the United States, but one of the things that we see is often just a lack of awareness about who Sikhs are. And that lack of awareness then often translates to being left out of data and left out of public policy. So like my colleagues did, I'll share some statistics. So I think that also kind of helps to contextualize the challenges. So in 2012, there was a shooting at a Gurdwara, a Sikh house of worship in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. And after that, one of the victims, her son, testified in front of Congress and said that he wanted his mother to be given the dignity of being a statistic because the FBI at that time didn't track anti-Sikh hate crimes and many other communities as well. So we started a campaign along with other partner organizations to ask the FBI to include anti-Sikh hate crimes in their report. So the first time the FBI included anti-Sikh data was in 2015. And since then, Sikhs have been among the top 5, if not the top 3, most targeted faith groups for hate crimes, and that's nationally, along with Muslim and Jewish communities as well. The challenge is that while the FBI data set is kind of the best that we have, it's not fully comprehensive. So, we talked about the lack of reporting, but for the Sikh community, there's also often, because of that lack of awareness, either a miscategorization of hate crimes or they're not categorized at all. So I'll give an example for here. Although New York State has one of the largest Sikh populations across the United States, New York law enforcement agencies have never reported an anti-Sikh hate crime into FBI data. So part of the work that we did was to try to address this issue, and we wanted to start by having conversations with the NYPD. So in April of last year, there were 3 incidents where elderly Sikh men were attacked in Queens. The first incident was categorized as anti-Muslim incorrectly, and then the other 2 were just categorized broadly as anti-religion. And so we started to have some of those conversations on why it's important to categorize correctly, why that data is important to our communities, how data drives public policy. And so in those cases, I believe that it was categorized correctly as anti-Sikh, but also that should happen consistently every time for every community that experiences hate without the intervention of a civil rights organization. So there's a lot of work to be done still, but happy to be having this conversation with everyone, especially in community and in partnership with everyone here. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Audacia and I take they and she pronouns, and I'm with the New York City Anti-Violence Project. AVP is a 40-plus-year-old organization that was founded as an all-volunteer group of LGBT people who were responding to hate violence in Chelsea. At the time, there was no police response, and LGBT people were kind of left on their own to figure out what to do. So this group of volunteers put together a group to start responding to hotline calls. So they had a hotline that was run out of someone's kitchen. That hotline persists today as a 24/7 bilingual English-Spanish hotline that is available by phone and by text. It's the only LGBT rape crisis center in New York State, and AVP is the largest queer anti-violence organization in the country. So today, the way that our organization functions is that we do a lot of community-based reporting through the hotline. So members of the queer community who do not feel comfortable calling the police or want additional assistance in figuring out what to do will call AVP's hotline, and that gives them access to our free counseling and legal services, as well as our advocacy programs. So we kind of link together reporting with counseling, direct services, and public advocacy to speak up for LGBTQ people who have been harmed. And we do focus on hate violence, but we also respond to intimate partner and sexual violence that happens inside the community. So LGBTQ members of our community experience bias from lots of different sources. So from families of origin, roommates, landlords, people in public spaces based on them being perceived to be LGBTQ. And they also experience biased treatment from police, employers, and healthcare professionals. And we also know that for the folks in our community who are multiply marginalized, particularly folks who are Black and or trans, these experiences are much more intense and much more frequent. And we also do identify some of policing and police incidents and bias crimes from the police as hate violence. And we know that over the past couple of years in New York City, particularly in the month of June, which is Pride Month, is a month that we see more incidents of hate violence and bias from the police themselves. Nationally and also here in New York, we've been seeing an increase in the rhetoric and anti-LGBT harassment and particularly anti-trans legislation. And a lot of the bias that's starting to happen is also explicitly coming from groups that identify as anti-LGBTQ and white supremacists. So it's not random acts, it's organized hate violence that we're seeing a lot of. And this is very present in New York City. We have been working very closely with Drag Story Hour to develop community safety plans and trainings and support with them. And since November of 2022, about 80% of their events are being actively protested here in New York. And we know that also some of the performers we work closely with have experienced protests of their events up to 12 times. So what we're seeing is a persistence of harassment and violence and people experiencing repeat incidents. So there's not single moments that folks are experiencing, they're happening over and over again. So that's one of the things that we're really thinking about in New York and also throughout the country, the way that the commonality and the repetition of these incidents impacts people's health and well-being, ability to move through the world, ability to access services, and it is taking a pretty heavy toll. I mentioned that AVP also works on intimate partner and sexual violence, and we have been seeing that these things do not recede in times when we're facing lots of hate violence, but it actually acts as kind of a pressure cooker within the community, so we're seeing also increased rates of intra-community violence. So there are a lot of different things that we need to be paying attention to and looking at the interplay of how those things knit together.
Hi, my name is Frankie Miranda. I'm the president and CEO of Hispanic Federation. We are an umbrella organization with a network of more than 600 organizations in 42 states and the territories. We started in 1990 here in New York City by a handful of organizations that felt that the nonprofit sector that it was Latinx-led, Latinx-serving, needed an organization to advocate and also provide them with capacity building grants and technical assistance. We took the Jewish Federation model and we adapted to our community, and that's how almost 33 years later, we are a national organization and we're doing services all across the country with offices also in Washington, D.C. The Rabbi mentioned something about not trying to make this conversation about who suffers more. This is not the Olympics of suffering, but every time one of my esteemed panelists speak about, I say, that happens in my community. That happens in my community. Because what hate tries to do is to silence us and make us invisible, while our work is to try to show that our communities are diverse, that they are not monolithic, that there are Latinx people like me that are queer, there are Latinx people that are Muslim, that Asian hate affect Latinos too, because also women have been attacked by assuming that they are Asian or not. Everything that has been said here affects all of us, and what the other side is trying to do is to try to force us to compete for the limited resources. And we understand that there are disparities in education, health, housing, resources, and that's exactly what they would like to do, for us to say, no, I suffer more, and my community is the one that needs to have the resources, that needs to have the funding, because there has been this knee-jerk reaction out there in which philanthropy and corporations say, like, no, we need to take care of this community first. And then there's another incident, we go to this other community. And in order to have a fair and equitable recovery, especially after COVID, we need to elevate all our communities at the same time. We need to respect our communities at the same time. I think that everything that has been said here happens in the communities that we serve. People feeling apprehension in reporting, that the past federal administration created a sense that we didn't belong, that the past federal administration created that it was okay to tell people, go back to your country, when people have been here for generations. What I feel that we need to continue doing is educating our community, using community-based organizations, religious organizations, to provide culturally competent linguistically competent information. People need to understand how to report what is an act of violence. People need to know where to go. Currently, we are funding organizations in Staten Island, La Colmena, that they have safety ambassadors going community to community and businesses to talk about what exactly is a bias incident, or Voces Latinas in Queens, that they are serving the community, especially trans, LGBTQ, Latinx, and they found out that 76% of members of the community in Queens feel apprehension and going to report something to the police. El Puente in Brooklyn, that they are doing amazing work with youth, educating them about how to intervene, and not always you have to be a hero and stop an incident, but you can be supportive and you can talk about it, you can provide support, and of course, working with our immigrant community. Right now there is the potential of Title 42 ending tomorrow, and we know that right now the rhetoric around the country is all against immigrants, like another more famous Miranda said, immigrants, we get the job done. This country has been built with people that have been forced to be here, to come here by many circumstances. But the fact is that we need to ensure that we all have this conversation and understand that we have more things in common than things that divide us, because that's exactly what the other side wants to do. And when people say, like, well, Latinos are also racist, I said, like, let's have this conversation when we understand that in our countries of origin, there are painful histories of slavery, genocide, colonialism that forces people out of this country, in many cases responsible for the foreign policy of this country. And when we come here, we need to make sense of a whole new structural racism, a new system of oppression that also forces us, as I said before, to compete for the limited resources. So by having this conversation, we understand that we have more things in common and that we can actually work together.
I'm Reverend Mark Blue. I am the president of the Buffalo NAACP chapter and also the pastor of the Second Baptist Church. And to all my panelists, I wish I would have went first. Can I start out by asking a question? Who here was born in America originally? No. Let's get deeper. Who here's family was born in America? Who was a true American here? We all came from someplace else. And we're fighting over a piece of a pie that's not even ours. Everybody came from someplace else originally. And we're dealing with socialism, capitalism. We're dealing with identities. We're dealing in areas that we haven't even originated from. One of the things that people fail to realize is that the Indians were here probably more than we were here. And America took their property. We all came from someplace else. So why are we fighting? I look at slavery. And the slaves, especially African-American slaves, were forced to come here. And we have a lot of people who choose to come here. And I'm not trying to say that who suffered more. But when we look at even everything that's been happening, America was built off of foreign people. And one of the things that we're doing, we have, I'm sorry if I'm just going to be real, we have people who are white who are saying that people who are non-white have no value and meaning. Whenever I go anywhere, I can't change my color. I'm an African American all day long, 365 days a year. I've learned that in order for us to get along, we have to get along. It's not your ethnicity, it's not your gender. If you are a genuine person and you want to do great things, you can't do them by yourself. We need one another. That's America. We're a melting pot. We're a salad bowl. And our differences are our strength. It takes each and every one of us here to make it in America. I can't point the finger at you, and you can't point the finger at me. Because if we continue to do that, there's going to be war, there's going to be hell to pay, and we will never get along. Can I just share with you the NAACP's vision? The vision is, we envision an inclusive community rooted in liberation, where all persons can exercise their civic and human rights without discrimination. And our mission is to achieve equality, political rights, and social inclusion, and by advancing policies and practices that expand human and civil rights, eliminating discrimination, and accelerate the well-being, education, and economic security of Black people and all persons of color. Everyone in here has a color. Everybody in here came from the crayon box. We all have a color. So why in the, okay, I'm going to use a good word, why in the heaven are we fighting? I want to first give thanks to Hazel Dukes, who is my boss. And if I don't do it, I won't get paid. But where I'm from, in Buffalo, we faced, and it's been highlighted here from every panelist, we faced last year, I'm just going to say last year, one of the horrific things that ever hit Buffalo. And that is when a white racist came thinking he was better than the East Buffalo community. And he shot up Tops Market, which was a gathering place of the African-American community in East Buffalo. And that was a soft target because Buffalo was complacent. We did not think outside the box. We only had one grocery store in a 3-mile area. And that's sad. That's tragic. And that has affected us. And I'm still mad about it. But one thing that you did not read in the news, you did not read one looting or riot. You did not read about a car being flipped over. You didn't read about anybody getting beat up. Because Buffalo has learned how to be resilient. We say we are a city of good neighbors, then why in the world they would have to have a tragedy in order for good neighbors to come out? And that's the same with each and every one of us. Our communities have been ostracized. Our communities have been berated. Our communities have been targeted. But why do we have to have tragedies in order for us to have this type of form? I get tired. I get upset. I feel like cussing, but I'm not going to do that today. We're facing some of the same woes. And if we don't come together now as Americans, because we've mistreated one another, let's just put it out there. If we don't come together and recognize that our differences are our strengths, we'll be having this conversation next year, and the following year, and the following year. I'm tired of conversations, y'all. Let's roll up our sleeves and let's work this out. Let's get moving. Because one of the things that has been said to me and ingrained to me, if you forget your history, you're going to be doomed to repeat it. We don't need that. We need to go forward. There's a lot of scars that everybody has and they will always have, but we have to learn how to let those scars heal and go forward. I don't want to be equal. I want equality. I want to look over the fence like everybody else looks over the fence. So I can't have the same box as somebody else because they might be taller than me. We have to learn how to work together. And one of the things that I'm proud about the NAACP is where we want to work together. If one race excels, guess what? That pulls everybody else up. If one ethnicity gets some improvements, guess what? That pulls everybody else up. I've learned in my career as a pastor and being in Lackawanna, one of the, I'm not going to even talk about it, but one of the cities that I work in, if I win by the cards you deal me, then damn it, you got to give me what I want. We're playing political games. But you know what? We can win if we do it together. So if I win by the cards you give me, for you to save face, you have to give me what I want. And I want equality. I want to be looked at and not screw-faced. I want to be able to walk the streets and not have somebody clutch their purse when I walk by. We get that. And I can't change my color. But if you don't respect me, we can have this conversation next year. This will be a never-ending conversation. And when are we going to put it to rest? Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, because I think you gave a lot for the audience to think about. I heard some common themes, some references to like fundamental values and concepts like trust, like belonging. Also, I think some themes around the same anxieties that are shared across communities and populations around reporting, things that organizations have done and that communities have done to organize and protect themselves, things that they've done to fill in gaps in terms of data collection. And then also, I think this really trenchant analysis around some of the common roots of the threats that are faced by all of our communities, and also the need for us to come together and work together to try to address them. So next, I'm going to invite our panelists to share a little bit about some of the initiatives and the programs that your organizations have in place or are developing to address hate and bias. And, some of you have already gone into that territory and shared a little bit, but, if you want to add to that or if you haven't had a chance to speak to that yet, I'd invite you to do so now. I think I'll start with Rabbi Hauer, but if there are others, we can kind of popcorn it a little bit more as we
I
go.
insist that you start with somebody else first this time, please. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm gaining from listening. I'll
Yes.
take my turn.
Yeah, is there anyone else who'd like to kind of get us started with this? Great. Dr. Debbie?
So one of the things that we do at Bridging Culture Group is we do training on various communities. Okay. Yeah, hello. I can use my future voice. Is that not working? Okay, thank you. Let's start this over.
Nice.
Okay, one of the things that we do at Bridging Cultures Group is we provide training specifically on various ethnic groups. We are the go-to for Arab, Muslim, and South Asian cultures. So, for example, what we did with the New York City public school system for the last 2 years is we focused on Arab, Muslim, and South Asian communities, specifically Yemeni Americans, Bangladeshi Americans, and the West African Muslim communities. These are the 3 largest communities that are right now growing and thriving in New York City. And the school personnel know very little about how to be culturally responsive to these communities. And so with the training, virtual and in person, it's been an incredible shift in helping educators and families and principals, guidance counselors really understand how to be culturally responsive to students. And so it's been really incredible. In addition, the Muslim Community Network also does diversity education in New York City public schools. They also do youth leadership programming, and they talk about race, they talk about religion, they talk about all these things that make up society to really help shape and mold the next generation of leaders. And it's unfortunate because young people don't get the opportunity in a school setting to have these kinds of conversations. And so it is really, really critical for us to think about this. And one thing that our keynote speaker, Loretta Lynch, said that was really profound was we cannot normalize hate. And so we really have to be very cognizant about the words that we use when we describe communities or describe incidents or describe fringe groups. A prime example of this, which pains me and pains a lot of American Muslims, is the use of the word jihadist. There are children in our school system, in our communities, that have the name jihad. Jihad stands for inner struggle to be the best that you can be in the sight of God. A parent who chooses to name their child that is because they want that child to grow up in a world to be the best they can be in the sight of God, to serve humanity. And so when we hear the word jihadist, Islamist, and all of these other, with the IST at the end, it psychologically and emotionally impacts our children, and it also incites hate against Muslims. And so it's really critical for us as community, as officials, as leaders of organizations, etc., to really be mindful of the language. When we want to talk about groups that terrorize us, call them by their name: Al-Qaeda, Daesh, ISIS, white supremacists, neoconservatives, whatever the title is. But I think it's really important for us to understand the power of words and the pain that they cause.
Thank you, Dr. Debbie. And I think Nikki and then maybe Reverend Blue. Go ahead, Nikki.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. I think obviously I'm a little biased because I work here, but I think at the Sikh Coalition, we try to take a pretty comprehensive approach at addressing hate and discrimination, not just for the Sikh community, but for all marginalized communities. So we kind of try to split the work into both the proactive and the reactive. And the reactive model is unfortunately something that we've perfected. It's what we call, kind of our rapid response mode. What do you do the first 24 hours after a hate crime, the first week, the few months afterwards? And, over the past couple years have been working with other organizations to share that model because, as everyone here knows, hate crimes are not unique to the Sikh community. But on the proactive side, our legal team takes on clients pro bono. On our policy and advocacy team, we do a ton of work to advocate for equitable legislation when it comes to hate crimes, employment discrimination, school bullying. We have a communications and media team that works on what we call raising the Sikh profile, ensuring that, when Sikhs are written about in the media, it's not just after a hate incident. So helping to place positive stories about the Sikh community, ensuring that when we are included in the media, it's done so accurately. So we have a reporter's guide. We have a full, community team that's doing community trainings and making sure people are aware of their rights. And then on the education side, doing a ton of work to ensure that Sikhs are taught about in a constitutionally appropriate manner in social studies and history classes across the United States. In New York State, if people are, wanting to take action here, for the past few months, we've been working with a coalition of AA and HPI organizations on a AA and HPI history bill in the legislature. So you can write to Senator Liu and Assemblymember Lee right now and ask them to, support teaching about our histories in classrooms. At the city level, I know MCN's been mentioned a couple times. They've also been leading out on a resolution that would require religious diversity curricula in schools. So I would say, at the state level, at the city level, there's so many things that we can all be doing to take action. But yeah, organizationally, we try to take the approach of what can we do proactively so we're not just constantly in the reactive space.
Thank you, Nikki. I think we'll go to Reverend Blue, and then we'll go over to Eugena.
We've been working with several organizations, the Jewish Federation of Buffalo, New York. We've been working with the Buffalo Urban League, with Open Buffalo, with Push Buffalo. These are organizations that we're teaming up to do. One of the things that we also realize is that the power of your voice is in your vote. So we do our mass voter registration. We do voter registration education on voting. We have events coming up to meet the candidates. We are looking at also doing health. We deal with health and environmental justice because that's some of the things that's happening in our community. In Buffalo, we have Lackawanna, and we have other areas where there's high toxicity. So we're doing a lot of education. One of the things that we believe in is that you need to educate. Education is the key. And if you don't educate, then we'll continue to exasperate some of the things that we should have eradicated earlier. So we're working in with these organizations because we believe in what we're doing. We're also working on food insecurity to help eliminate what has happened in Buffalo, and hopefully in other communities it won't happen. We're trying to get a model together to make sure that there are enough grocery stores, and not just corner stores, but grocery stores and employability in those stores of minority communities. So, we're working very assertively on that. And with the organization that I mentioned, we're being dogmatic about it. We're saying that you have to give us what we want. And we're also working with our political affiliates as well. Our governor, my governor, is right in my community. So we work closely with the governor and with the mayor of the city of Buffalo to make these things happen.
Thank you. Eugena?
At TAF, as I mentioned, we are a funder, a convener, and an incubator. And, the 4 pillars of work are anti-hate, education, narrative change, resources, and representation. So in the anti-hate space in New York City, we are honored to partner and bring in, we committed this year to $2.4 million in funding directly to our community-based organizational partners. About a month ago, maybe less than a month ago, we did make an announcement for our first 14 partners. Sikh Coalition is one of them, and I know several other of our grantee partners are in the audience. And we distributed about $1.45 million in our initial commitments. And our goal is to make that, general operating funding over the next 3 years repeatable. So that would be 1.45 repeatable next year and the year after. And the entire reason why we're doing this is because we know that in New York City there are many sophisticated and long-serving, neighborhood community organizations that have been doing the work to serve our most vulnerable populations for 30 to 40 years, and they are the ones who are best positioned to lead the work to respond to and help survivors of anti-Asian hate and bias navigate the systems that are ostensibly designed for them but are often failing them, right, at every turn. I actually had a conversation with someone who is a survivor herself over lunch, and she was telling us about her experience as, as a public health nurse who experienced, an anti-Asian hate incident, an assault, and, as a very sophisticated person was having an incredible challenge in navigating the system, simply because people were just not helping her. I mean, I don't know how else to really describe it. So I think, when it comes to the not reporting part, many of us are discouraged from reporting because it doesn't go anywhere, right? It doesn't actually do anything, and I think there's something there that we can probably work on as a collective. But just to kind of go back to the anti-hate, we were calling it the Anti-Hate Collaborative Network, right? This is a group of 14 nonprofit organizations who are on the front lines working with survivors, and our goal is to convene them so that they can share best practices and do some cross-learning and hopefully help lift up other gaps in services that we can then resource as an organization. And one of the things that we also want to do is use our kind of, influence as a funder, as a newer funder, to put pressure on other entities that do funding in this area in New York City, right, specific to, vulnerable populations, and put pressure on them to meet us at the table and fund as well. Because there are a lot of institutions and corporations that give away money in New York City, and too often our populations are overlooked. And there's something that we can do here around the multiplier effect. And finally, I think in that incubation space, we are hoping that we can create better cross-racial solidarity and community with other organizations. And, I think we are in learning and listening mode, right? I think one of the things that we have heard and we have experienced and, we've been kind of told is we are now looking to gather our allies and create a coalition of support. But in order to do that, we also need to be good allies, right? Like, we need to show up for other communities, not just when it's convenient and not just when it serves our own purpose. And I think there's a lot of learning that we have to do there and a lot of kind of healing we have to do within our own community. And we are in that journey and we're on that process, in that process.
Thank you. Go ahead, Rabbi Hauer.
Okay. Now that I'm not first, thank you. I have benefited from listening to everybody, and I want to perhaps echo and highlight. First of all, the issue of reporting. I think what you just said about sometimes people are afraid to report, but sometimes people feel, why bother? Why bother? What's going to really happen as a result of this report? And when we speak about that phrase, which the Attorney General used before, of normalizing hatred, we read, unfortunately, it seems every day about something dramatic. The Reverend referred before to that horror last year in Buffalo, but yesterday and the day before, there are horrible events which are happening. But there's a general lower-level climate change of things which don't make it to a newspaper, which, if you call the police, they will shrug. And this is not an indictment of the police. There's too much of the trouble and too little of a resource to respond. And we don't have a magic solution on our end. But I think that when we've tried, it can be a bit frustrating. It can be a bit difficult, because it's hard to get communities to know each other. It really is. And even if you do get them a little bit of more education in a classroom or something like that, we know these are small measures. They all count. They all make a difference. They're all important. But people are in their own communities to some degree. They are in their own spaces to some degree. And we will have limits to our conversations together as well, because we're all going to be busy with doing things internally with our communities and so on. But as you said, we have to be each other's allies. As leaders, we set a tone, and we talk, and when we're raising our voices of concern, of solidarity, of objection, of not allowing for a normalization of hatred, no matter who it is addressed towards, who that hatred is addressed towards. That's our job. That's our task. That's the task of all of us. Anybody who's sensitive to it, anybody who's here is giving a day and is probably giving so much of your life to this theme, to this topic. And again, I apologize on behalf of all of us that we're just not looking at you enough because we can't see you. But all of us have dedicated such a significant chunk of our lives, not only to lift up our own communities and not only to protect our own communities, but to make a better world for everybody. And we need to raise our voices for that without being shy, with being strong, being assertive. Hate is everybody's common enemy.
Wonderful way to transition into our next question. But before I do that, I just want to see whether anyone else on the panel has anything else they want to share about initiatives. Daisha? Yeah.
So I love hearing the way that all of these pieces of work are weaving together. And one of the things I'm hearing about, we need resources to put into our communities. We need to develop response systems and support. And one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot in recent weeks, AVP has produced a LGBTQ Safe Spaces needs assessment that we ran from December to March, and we have a report coming out in June. And it was specifically looking at LGBTQ spaces, so spaces on college campuses, faith communities that were targeted towards LGBTQ people, bars, other events like the drag story hour events that don't have a concrete and continuing space but have their events in different places, and the ways that they were being targeted during 2022, and really by hate groups, not just individuals. And as I've been working through it, working through the data, I've been looking very closely at, okay, so we've talked a lot about what is the response, what are the resources we need, What does it look like to do rapid incident response? What's the prevention tactics? And then I came upon a question that we hadn't been asking but need to ask and ask each other, which is, what does resolution look like? So last night I did a community safety training for groups that are preparing for Pride events and are starting to plan out what does safety look like on the ground, what do they need to think about, very concrete ways. Their spaces, who they have to help them, who it might cause problems, and how they're going to respond and make a full plan for what they need to do to keep themselves safe. And one of the questions we asked was, what is safety? What does it look like to you? And what does it look like to feel a sense of resolution and reconnecting with community after something goes wrong? And I know we want to talk about prevention and also thinking about, like, what's the follow-up? What does that look like? And so a lot of the folks were saying, safety to me is being heard, being acknowledged, being affirmed, and having secure housing, having access to food, having access to healthcare. It's all of these like basic needs in people's lives, but that safety is really about having a sense of being acknowledged, being able to walk down the street and be your proud self, and being able to exist with other people in public space. So I think it's really important for us to continue to think about, what does it look like, not just in the aftermath, but what does it look like to hold safety together continuously? Do we need to hold individuals responsible? Yes. And how do we make space to come together as a community to say, regardless of whether or not a person who did harm feels bad about it or reconsiders their perspective, how do we as communities hold each other and move forward?
So important. Frankie, was there something you wanted to share quickly?
This is amazing. To continue in that point, I think that our model has always been that we believe that organizations have the particular responses for their particular communities. And we're constantly, while we adopt models and we provide best practices to organizations, we truly believe that we need to fund those organizations and provide the resources to organizations that are going to find the nuances, the different ways in which you can communicate with your community about hate and prejudice and empowering communities. But the fact is that more and more we hear about lack of funding and we're thinking about the budgets and we're thinking about what's happening in the state and what happened in the city. There's a constant fear that some of these programs are not going to continue to be supported. Just as a statistic, less than 1% of philanthropic support, institutional philanthropy support, go to Latinx organizations. So we're already going in an uphill battle. We are all in an uphill battle, but we truly believe that those trusted sources in the community are these communities or community-based organizations, and that they have the best models and the best practices to best address these issues in their own communities.
Thank you, Frankie. And that's actually also, I think, another great opportunity to move on to the next question. And I'll probably invite maybe just a couple folks, because we're running low on time, because you guys have had so much insight to share. But how do you envision, when you think about, we're recognizing that this is a shared responsibility. And when you're thinking about collaborations between government and community, what do you envision there? Like, how do you think that should look? I'd invite, just a couple of you to maybe share some words on that. I think we've already started from some of the commentary, yeah.
First I have to give a disclaimer. I said that President Dukes is my boss, and if I don't acknowledge her, I won't get paid. I am a non-paid volunteer. The work I do for the NAACP is the work that I love to do, so I want to say that. But what does it look like? One of the things that government needs to do is look like the community. In Buffalo, when they first wanted to give mental health counselors, they had a lot of white mental health counselors coming into a black community to service a black community. That's a no-no. They quickly corrected that because there are organizations that have black mental health counselors. And even the clergy were being used to help in that area. So there needs to continue to be a partnership with government, because government is, we support government, we pay government, so we should have access to the funds that we give government through our taxes. So there needs to be more of a partnership where government needs to look like the community and the community look like government.
Thank you, Reverend Blue. Others, Dr. Debbie, it looks like you have
Sure. Is it working? It is working. Okay. So a couple of things, that come to mind for the community that I represent, right? Thank you for mentioning the religious diversity resolution in the New York City Council, which is Resolution 476, to actually incorporate in K-12 setting religious diversity education to mitigate hate incidents, bullying that is tied to, racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. Really important. The other thing that I think would be really incredible is to also normalize AAPI holidays. For example, the Chinese Lunar Year and a number of other holidays, the Muslim holidays. We already have these holidays now within the New York City public school system. Imagine if we had it statewide, if this was incorporated, right? Our children will get to learn about how their peers celebrate their holidays, which are no different than theirs, and really is a teachable moment for them to learn about the different cultures and religions within the communities. Also, we'd love to see the New York State Senate to co-sponsor and support Senate Bill 2410, which is the Safe School Improvement Act. Really important in addressing hate crimes in schools and ways to make school officials report them, because there is a lot of incidents that are happening that are not being reported. And our hope also is for Governor Hochul to pass policies that would end unlawful surveillance of Muslims through facial recognition technology, and also to abolish the gang database in New York State, which is really criminalizing so many Black and brown communities. And lastly, and I think this is something that we've all talked about, is just making sure that we have funding. We all talked about the need for resources. So the resources that are needed are funding. Funding to organizations that grassroots communities trust the most, to be the ambassadors, the messengers, to provide those services. Nobody knows their community better than any of us sitting here. And I think if we are deliberate in making sure that we fund organizations to provide this service, as well as, school districts, empowering them to bring this work, because we cannot do it without the K-12 school system. It has to start with our children and upward.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that question before we kind of do our final round? All right. Well, then for our kind of final prompt, I'm going to offer a couple different options. So the first is, we kind of started this conversation, talking about having each of you speak a little bit about the issues that confront your communities. Many of you kind of talked about the long histories of your communities in this country and this state, and also, I think rightly talked about the importance of us moving beyond conversation and kind of figuring out, like, what are the next steps? How do we take action? So the first kind of alternative prompt or option for a prompt is, what is something that folks who are in the audience this afternoon can do that would help to address and prevent hate? The other option is just to kind of help us end on a hopeful note. So is there something that you have seen, something that you have participated in, something that makes you feel some hope about how we're going to make progress against this really complicated constellation of challenges? So I see some mics going up, which is great. So I think maybe I'll start here with Frankie, but I'd love to hear from each of you before we wrap up.
I think that something that I mentioned before is that we don't need to try to be heroes and intervene every time we see some incident of hate. But we do have the responsibility, everybody here in the audience, all of us have the responsibility to talk about it, to be able to provide support, to be able to report. It's not always safe to intervene, but we can always say to that person that has been victimized or after the fact, being able to discuss it, provide support, being able to report it. It is on all of us. Every time we are on a subway car and we see something happening, to be able to observe, and even if it is just making eye contact with somebody that is going through something and say, I see you, right? And being able to offer afterwards when it's safe for that person or for yourself, to be able to provide that support, that conversation, and be able to be that positive reinforcement. What happened with hate, incidents of hate, is that sometimes we internalize it and it becomes part of that script that we have in the back of our head, especially for children and young people, and they feel less than, and we carry this around. But sometimes that word of support, it's incredibly healing, or will help that process of healing. And what we're doing here is extremely important. And of course, everybody these days is very sensitive. I want to ask everybody to not get defensive for offending me in a conversation, right? Or offending others. It is part of the dialogue, and this is the hard work, that sometimes we're going to say something wrong, but the reality is that we can still have a dialogue and get to a better understanding.
Audacia?
I will build off that a little bit. So I would say that everybody in this room can take an upstander or bystander training. Lots of our organizations offer them. AVP worked a couple of years ago to develop an upstander training with a group called NYC Against Hate, which was a citywide and cross-identity gathering of folks who created this upstander training. And we actually did, just before the pandemic, did a Day Against Hate across the city where we did 50 trainings across the city. And AVP offers that training both online and in person. And some of our partners, the Arab American Association of New York, Jews for Racial and Economic Justice, and the Center for Anti-Violence Education, all those groups also offer that training. They're free, they're like an hour or 90 minutes, and they can really help skill you up to do what Frankie has been talking about. We talk about there being 5 Ds of doing de-escalation. So the thing that most people think of is being direct, talking to the person who's doing harm and being like, don't do that. And that can also be a thing that escalates. So the other options that folks have, you can delay and connect with somebody after an incident, make eye contact with them, let them know that you know what's happening. You can create a distraction. This one is my personal favorite, where you could ask someone for directions or start clapping, or one of my musical theater friends loves to start singing and make something confusing that creates a break in the moment and shifts the vibe of what's happening. You can also document. You can film on the little cameras that we all have in our pockets, and then check in with the person who's been harmed to see what they want to happen with that video. And you can also delegate. You can, if you are the person to break the moment, you can bring other people into it and say, hey, you in the green sweatshirt, can you go notify the train conductor? And ask other people to get involved and create a we situation. This is our communities that we are walking around in every day, and we need to take ownership over that and really create that bond, maintain that bond with our fellow New Yorkers to be able to do that.
Thank you. Nikki, do you want to go, and then Dr. Kelly?
Yeah, I'll definitely back up, all the wonderful suggestions that the other panelists have made, and then maybe I'll take the other question in terms of what gives me hope. So in the Sikh faith, we believe in this concept called Chardikala, or living in eternal optimism. And so that means regardless of the trauma or challenges that we might face, remaining optimistic, not giving into that victim mentality. And that's not to invalidate anyone's experiences, and also not to say that means we sit back and do nothing. we also believe in sarbat davala, well-being for all. So something that gives me hope is that, in the Sikh community or the Sikh Coalition as a civil rights organization, while we are fighting for the well-being of our community, we're also doing that for other communities. And I think it gives me a lot of hope knowing that the communities here are doing the same for us. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So one thing that gives me hope is actually genuine validation. And what I mean by that is there is nothing that is more gratifying and rewarding than to have people in the beginning of Ramadan wish me a Ramadan Mubarak. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, nobody knew what Ramadan was, what Muslims did during Ramadan. We've come a long way, but we still have a lot to do. So this past Ramadan, the number of text messages, the number of emails, everywhere I went, everybody wished me Ramadan Mubarak. It was beautiful. It shows that people are eager to learn. And so what that tells us is that we really need to push ourselves out of our comfort level and work really hard in learning more about who our neighbors are. And so one of the things that we do at Bridging Cultures Group with companies is that we actually are getting them to assess their workforce. Who are their workforce? Where do they come from? How do they worship? What kind of food do they do? And through their employee resource groups, we are doing workshops to help demystify who these groups are within a company. And we basically tailor the workshops to answer the questions that you wish you can ask, but you don't know if you can ask, if you're nervous to ask, you're embarrassed to ask. We put it in a presentation, and everybody after the workshop is like, oh my God, I'm so glad I took this. I learned so much. I feel terrible. I've been doing it wrong all this time. Thank you. That's what we want. We want you to push yourself out of your comfort level, learn, and become culturally proficient.
Fabulous. Eugena, would you like to go next?
So something that gives me hope, I'll take that one, is the times that I've seen a survivor of a hate incident actually forgive their perpetrator. And I know that, it's incredibly complicated, but to see someone move past that, the anger and the hate to a place of forgiveness and, compassion, I think is really beautiful. And, Deja's point about resolution, made me think about that a little. I think, to be able to move past all of the bad feeling and maybe come to a place where one can understand that the perpetrator and all of us really are just, we're all a victim of the same systems that we live in.
Thank you.
Thank you. I want to speak about a point of optimism from a bit of a sad personal place. My mother, who should, God willing, continue to be well, she took a train ride in 1943, in early 1943, across Europe. She was running away with her parents from the Holocaust. She was in Hungary. The Nazis were coming into Hungary. She and her parents miraculously had visas to leave. They traveled on a train on a Friday evening. Observant Jews don't do that. And usually the woman of the house lights Shabbat candles. And my mother recalls how as they were traveling across Nazi-occupied Europe, her mother lit the candles, made the blessing, and snuffed out the candles, and told her children that we're doing this because we're running for our lives, and God willing, the next Sabbath and all future Sabbaths will light candles in a peaceful place. 2 years earlier, my father of blessed memory also took a train ride, but he didn't have a seat on the train. He, in September of 1941, in Romania, was put into a cattle car, together with dozens of others. Cattle cars, an empty box. And they traveled to Transnistria, which is an area of the Ukraine, one of the areas which was embroiled in conflict not so long ago, very recently. And he spent the 5 years there in forced labor. And thank God he survived. And he survived really remarkably as a positive and optimistic person. A few weeks ago was Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaShoah, the Jewish Holocaust Memorial Day. There's an international Holocaust Remembrance Day in January. The Jewish one comes really a few days after Passover. And our youth movement, which is called NCSY, has this project called Hate Ends Now. It's in one of the southern states. It's a cattle car, a replica of an old cattle car that can go from place to place, that people can walk into. They close the doors, kind of eerie, and they have a projection, like a sound and light show, video that shows on the walls. And you have actual survivors of the Holocaust telling their story for 15, 20 minutes. And they've been taking this, youth have been taking this to the parking lots of public schools, of sports arenas, and letting people hear the story from people who have experienced it. A few weeks ago, they decided they brought it for a day to the middle of Times Square in Manhattan. It's kind of a strange experience to walk into a cattle car with all that stuff going on around you, with all the celebration and the bazaar, and then having that door close and hear and see a story of history. And I had the privilege to step in there. And I stepped in there with people who didn't grow up on this stuff like I did. And watch them watch the story. You know, people often ask in communities of faith, for whatever tragedy we go through, like the Jewish version of the question was, where was God during the Holocaust? Everybody, every one of us has that question in one form or another in our own text. And we know that there's a bigger question. And that question is, where was man? Where was man? And when we have a chance to see how people can look at hatred and say, that's not me. That's not who I want to be. That's not human. It's not the way we need to be. Those are rays of light which we are seeing. We don't want people to see hatred, but we want to see people rise to stand up when they see it, to say, that is not me. And that's a note of optimism.
Thank you, Rabbi. And Reverend Blue, will close this out.
I'm going to make it short. Racism and hatred, that's learned behavior. If it's learned, it can be unlearned. And that's one of the things that we have to have that conversation around the dinner table when we're meeting with our children. And we don't often eat dinner a lot now with microwaves and everything else. But we need to have those conversations with our children around the table. And when we see it, as I think we all said, stand up and say no. We have to stand up and speak up so we can be heard. If it happens to me, if it happens to you, we need to support one another. So let's unlearn what has been learned in our country.
Thank you, Reverend. And I'll just conclude by saying it's been my immense honor to moderate this conversation. I'm so moved by everything that you've shared, and I hope everyone else in the audience kind of takes that invitation, to take action, to stand up, to see hate, and to say, that's not who I am, and that's not the city or the state or the country that I want to live in, and to figure out what your role is in changing that. So thank you very much.